Okay. Ay.
On June 3rd, 1968, a tiny and scruffy woman walked up to a rookie cop in New York City's Times Square and confessed that she had just shot the famous artist, Andy Warhol. "The police are looking for me," she said as she handed over 2 pistols she used to shoot Warhol. About Andy Warhol, she said, "He had too much control over my life." She revealed that her name was Valerie Solanas. Although she was 32 years old, she lied and said that she was 28. She didn't have a phone number, home address, or a job. Later, police escorted her to bookings, where they were met by a crowd of journalists. Valerie stopped to answer their questions. "I live nowhere," she said. "I'm a writer. Read my manifesto. It will tell you what I am." She was referring to this book, the Scum Manifesto, aka Society for Cutting Up Men, a radical diatribe calling for the extermination of all men. Valerie left the authorities and the press scratching their heads. Her motive for shooting Warhol was unclear because she wouldn't answer any questions about it directly. Further investigations revealed that she had known Andy Warhol personally and had played a small role in one of his films.
Valerie, why did this happen?
Because he's a
Well, let's clean it up a little. Pretty fun put on the air. Why did this happen?
because he's a piece of garbage.
Rumors spread that she had shot Andy Warhol because he wouldn't produce her play. She denied those rumors and clarified that she shot him because she believed that he was involved in a plot against her, led by a man named Maurice, who was conspiring to steal her literary work. When Warhol survived, she said years later that she considered her shooting a moral act. It was immoral, she said, to have missed. Quote, "I should have done target practice." How did Valerie Solanas become the political extremist who shot Andy Warhol? Well, perhaps I can convince you that she was a product of her environment. She grew up in poverty, she was a child of divorce, her alcoholic, porn-addicted father sexually abused her. She moved around a lot to live with different relatives. By 5 years old, she was already so hardened by life that when her grandfather beat her with a belt, she took it while laughing. As a teenager, she shoplifted, skipped school, and had promiscuous sex. Because of that, her family considered placing her in a mental hospital for oversexed women. When she was sent to Catholic school instead, she got into fistfights with boys and nuns. By the time she was 15, she had been pregnant twice. Her second child, David, didn't know that she was his mother until much later on in life. He went on to launch a successful business as an erotic underwear photographer of nude women. Despite the horrors of her childhood, she was an excellent student. She was more mature than her peers, wittier, and more driven. She scored 131 on an IQ test, placing her in the top 2% of the population. Under her high school yearbook photo, a caption read, "Val, brain power and a lot of spirit." Valerie enrolled at University of Maryland College Park, where she majored in psychology. There she excelled academically, but showed behavioral problems. She was forced to undergo psychological counseling due to frequent fights with her roommates. One time she threw a box of bottles at another student. In another instance, she got revenge on one of her roommates by peeing in her orange juice and placing it back in the fridge. At college, she started to formulate her worldview. She wrote columns for the school newspaper, often scathing rebukes against misogyny on campus. In her column, she ripped apart one of her male classmates for saying that women only went to college to find suitable husbands. Challenging the status quo has always been controversial, especially as a queer woman in the mid-1950s. So as you can guess, some loved her, but most despised her. Valerie received honors and enrolled in a master's program in psychology. During her graduate studies, she administered electric shocks to rats and dogs to study animal learning behaviors. Throughout her life, Valerie was burdened by financial problems. Even though her tuition was less than $100 per year, around $1,200 today, she struggled to stay afloat. In order to survive, she became a sex worker, something that she continued to do for the rest of her life. She rationalized sex for money as a cut-and-dry transaction. That way, she felt empowered by it rather than exploited. By seeing it in that way, she felt that she wasn't contradicting her feminist views. Despite that, in moments of vulnerability, she would reveal that she had sex with men for money, even though she hated men. Around that time, a Greek man named Popism proposed to her. Their marriage only lasted 6 months because it was a scheme to let him stay in the country. Back then, people just needed to get married in order to become a US citizen. Paul most likely paid Valerie to marry him, and then they divorced once he became a citizen. Soon, Valerie dropped out of graduate school. After a year spent traveling the country and taking some courses at Berkeley, she set her sights on New York City, and she fell in love with Greenwich Village. Back home, she stood out. But in Greenwich Village, she saw drag queens, as well as lesbian couples holding hands. It was the early days of the queer community, and Valerie felt like she finally found home. In New York City, she never stayed in one place for too long, often getting evicted for missing rent payments. For some time, she stayed at the Chelsea Hotel, a famous residence for artists and eccentrics. The Chelsea Hotel opened its doors to starving artists working on their masterpieces. Artists who had promising futures were allowed to put off paying rent for months, even years. The Chelsea Hotel is also where Sid Vicious of the Sex Pistols killed his girlfriend Nancy Spungen with a hunting knife. Valerie Solanas believed that she was ready to join the annals of artistic history, along with other great men and women who stayed at the Chelsea Hotel. She decided that she was destined to become a celebrated writer. So for a period of 5 years, she lived the life of a starving artist while working on a play called Up Your Ass. The play featured Bongi Perez, a wisecracking sex worker and panhandler who was an obvious stand-in character for Valerie. The play is made up of a series of profane, countercultural vignettes, the kind of which would have fit neatly in the pages of Robert Crumb's underground comics. Valerie created a colorful cast of characters based on people she encountered in New York City. Drag queens, religious fanatics, career girls, and misogynistic Johns. In one scene, an infanticide leads to a baby's body being discarded in a bush. In another, Valerie's stand-in, Bongi Perez, coolly tells a John that she never takes men back to her apartment, right before finishing him off in an alley for $25. The play meant the world to Valerie. For years, she obsessed over it, refining it until perfection. From 1960 until 1967, she survived by waitressing, begging, and by sex work. She bummed cigarettes, ate unfinished food off of other people's plates, and when she couldn't afford $12 a week for rent, she'd sleep on rooftops, or pester people to let her stay with them, even people she hated. In 1965, Valerie copyrighted her play Up Your Ass and sent it to a rising star named Andy Warhol. Warhol never got the play the first time she sent it to him, but eventually, she'd hand it to him in person, setting off a course of events that would lead to her shooting him with a .32 Beretta automatic pistol. Andy Warhol. For a man so synonymous with the 20th century art world, he was extremely disliked by it. The art world's insiders and critics detested Warhol's shallowness. His art was perceived as empty, insipid, pedestrian, and Warhol agreed. If you want to know all about Andy Warhol, just look at the surface of my paintings and films and me. And there I am. There's nothing behind it. Although Andy Warhol never actually said that, it was made up by a journalist named Gretchen Berg, he adopted the quote as his own. And it was exactly the sort of thing he'd love to say to journalists. Just like the time when he was asked why he painted money, and he said, "One lady friend of mine asked me, 'What do you love most?' I said money, and that's how I started painting money." His name at birth was Andy Warhol. His parents were working-class immigrants from the Carpathian Mountains, where the plot of Dracula happens to be set. He grew up in a slum in Pittsburgh. Every day for lunch, while his dad was off working in the coal mines, his mother would make him Campbell's soup. In 1949, he arrived in New York City at 21 years old. He was penniless, but by the time he died, his estate was worth $220 million. When his first client incorrectly credited him as Andy Warhol, he decided that he liked it better than his actual name, Warhola, so he dropped the A. He was a commercial artist through and through. He spent his 20s drawing shoes for advertisements, and it made him rich. Shoes and feet continued to be a theme in his work, not surprising considering that he was a foot and shoe fetishist. In the 1950s, he was the opposite of cool. He was gangly, pale, with blotchy skin. He was balding, awkward, and deeply insecure of his bulbous nose, which he tried to have shaved down. By 25 years old, he was making $50,000 a year, around $650,000 today. But he was still a virgin who lived with his mother. Well, to be fair to Andy Warhol, his mother lived with him. One night she arrived and announced that she'd left Pennsylvania for good to, quote, "come live with my Andy." He said that she could stay, but just until he got a burglar alarm. Later, she sold off their family home and told him that she'd stay until he found a nice young woman. Of course, Andy Warhol was gay, so she remained living with him until she died in 1972. Although he was doing tremendously well as a commercial artist, Andy Warhol was plagued by stinging rejections from peers in the art world. A New York socialite described Andy Warhol as the most colossal creep I have ever seen in my life. When Warhol tried to befriend the American novelist Truman Capote, Capote wanted nothing to do with him, and he's even told by Capote's mother to leave him alone. Afterwards, Warhol prepared his first solo art show called 15 Drawings based on the writings of Truman Capote, and he invited Capote, who never showed up. Although the two eventually became friends, Capote said of Warhol, "He used to stand outside of my house, just stand there all day waiting for me to come out. He wanted to become a friend of mine, wanted to speak to me, to talk to me. He nearly drove me crazy." There are so many stories of Warhol taking on horrible rejections that it's hard not to feel sorry for the guy. The Museum of Modern Art wouldn't accept his artwork, even when he tried to give it away to them for free. When he tried to introduce himself to the artists Jasper Johns and Robert Rauschenberg, they literally turned their backs towards him. Later he asked a mutual friend why they didn't like him, and he was told it was because he was a commercial artist and too swish, meaning too gay. Jasper Johns and Robert Rauschenberg were gay lovers, so the idea that they didn't like Warhol for being too swish was laughably ironic. But it was the late 1950s, and they were both abstract expressionists. You know, the drippy Jackson Pollock type paintings where a guy threw a bucket of paint at a canvas and called it art? Yeah, that. And abstract expressionists were tough guys who drank and got into fistfights. They were all Hemingway types. Even the gay ones were too straight to be swish. The fact that Warhol was too swish or too commercial for the art world of the late 1950s would actually go on to benefit him during the 1960s. Because by 1962, abstract expressionism was dead, and pop art was in. Warhol finally broke into the art world with paintings of advertisements for nose jobs, wigs, and tomato soup. Warhol wrote in his memoir, "Pop artists did images that anybody walking down Broadway could recognize in a split second. Comics, picnic tables, men's trousers, celebrities, show curtains, refrigerators, Coke bottles. All of the great modern things that abstract expressionists tried so hard not to notice at all." Andy Warhol became a rising star in the art world, and eventually, an icon signifying the very concept of fame. Along the way, he collected a ragtag group of Greenwich Village rent boys, vagabonds, cross-dressers, and speed addicts who he called his superstars. He purchased the loft and had it painted silver, and he named it the Silver Factory. It was a factory because there his assistants and him churned out paintings, designs, and films daily with industrial efficiency, aided by large doses of speed. It was also called the Silver Factory, as in the silver screen. Warhol loved the classic Hollywood era and replicated it with his own independent film scene. And it was during this time, while Warhol was making films, that he first met the woman who would try and kill him, Valerie Solanas. Critical thinking in today's divisive world has become more important than ever, and it has become crucial to seek out impartial narratives and look deeper into the evidence behind them. That's why I'm happy to work with Ground News as today's sponsor. Their app and website gathers the world's news in one place, so you can explore how different media outlets with unique biases cover the same story. I chose them as this channel's first ever sponsor because I appreciate what they're doing to make the news media landscape more transparent. I recommend checking out Ground News' Blind Spot feed. It helps you easily escape your echo chamber and find important stories circulating on different political sides, like this article about controversial fake Picasso paintings prompting a gender war on an Australian gallery. The artist created a women's-only area to highlight women's historical exclusion from male-dominated spaces. Ground News found 34 sources covering this, with barely any reporting coming from conservative outlets. They also calculated that 60% of these outlets are highly credible, helping me instantly find reliable information. And from there I can compare the world's reactions to the stunt. Here's The Guardian leading with how childish and unprofessional this was, while The Conversation seems to think this saga is one of the most effective pieces of performance art they've ever seen. As you can see, Ground News provides more insight than any single news article ever could. And as someone who tries my very best to tell stories as fairly as possible, I think that their platform perfectly aligns with my channel. So head to ground.news/Oki or scan my QR code on screen. Ground News is independent and subscriber focused, but you can get 40% off the same Vantage plan I use for unlimited access to all of their features. Now back to the video. Valerie Solanas met Andy Warhol through a mutual acquaintance who introduced the pair because he wanted to punish Warhol for annoying him. By the time Valerie walked into the factory scene, it was nearly over. It was the summer of 1967. Warhol spent the previous 4 years churning out experimental films of his factory disciples eating, performing fellatio, or just staring into the camera. He surrounded himself with fame-hungry performers that would do anything to impress him, as well as extremely wealthy young heiresses like Edie Sedgwick, Nico, and Bridget Berlin, who would also do anything to impress him. The factory in those days was full of the world's rejects, but when Valerie Solanas walked in, she quickly learned that she was an outcast even amongst the outcasts. Paul Morrissey, who is the filmmaker behind Warhol's only watchable movies, openly hated Valerie, calling her a pathetic street person and mentally defective. Warhol superstar Ultraviolet called her a dangerous cookie, a real bitch, after reading excerpts of the Scum manifesto. Before Warhol met Valerie Solanas, he had gotten some hot water with censors for explicit scenes in his films. So when Valerie Solanas presented her play to him, Up Your Ass, it was so vulgar that he assumed Valerie was an undercover cop trying to entrap him. This was back in the days when producing such a play could get someone arrested, so Warhol was cautious. Still, Warhol was amused by Valerie, and Valerie quickly did something that made her stand out. In response to him saying that he thought she was a lady cop trying to entrap him, she pulled down her pants, exposing her genitalia, and said, "Sure, I'm a cop, and here's my badge." Valerie wanted Warhol to produce her play Up Your Ass, and she also wanted him to adapt the Scum Manifesto into a film. The Scum Manifesto was Valerie's magnum opus. It's very short and worth a read if you can stomach pure violent misandry and homophobia. The message of the manifesto boils down to this. Men are incomplete women because the male gene is an incomplete X-female gene. Men are emotional cripples, egocentric, dumb, and desperately want to be women. Men are naturally sissies who want to be like their mommies, but daddy beats the urge out of them. Men's desire to be women is so profound that all gender dynamics are structured around it. Men project their real, feminine nature onto women. Traits like passivity are actually masculine traits, but men spend their whole lives fighting against their own passivity. In fact, men are obsessed with overcompensating to overcome their feminine nature. War, money, marriage, and the prevention of an automated society are institutions that exist to make men feel manly and to keep women down by convincing women that they are the passive ones instead of men. Basically, society has got it all wrong. When it comes to gendered traits, men are actually women and women are men. Valerie believed that once a man gives into his desire to be female, that he would be fulfilled by achieving continuous diffuse sexual feelings from being a woman. Valerie advocated for the genocide of all men who were not working alongside the Scum movement. She called Scum-friendly men the men's auxiliary of Scum and wrote, "Scum will kill all men who are not in the men's auxiliary of Scum." Quote, "Men in the men's auxiliary are those men who are working diligently to eliminate themselves. Men who, regardless of their motives, do good. Men who are playing ball with Scum." She also wanted to collect all the men in the world and keep them caged up for the purposes of stud farming. If a woman desired a child, she could simply choose from the stud cattle. Valerie made thousands of copies of the manifesto and sold it on the street, charging women $1 and men $2 for a copy. Valerie Solanas sent Warhol Scum recruiting posters to put in the factory bathroom and asked him if he'd like to join the men's auxiliary. Warhol found Valerie to be funny and bizarre. Valerie was a great talker, he said. Warhol wasn't the type to ever seriously engage with political action like Valerie was. Instead, he enjoyed hearing Valerie rant about things which he would record on tape, and later piss her off by putting her words into his films without payment. Still, Valerie saw Warhol as her golden ticket to fame. So during the summer and fall of 1967, she kept pestering him to produce her play, Up Your Ass, or make Scum Manifesto into a movie, or to fund a Scummy Thing event, or to just give her some money. Eventually, Warhol relented and threw her a bone. He said that it might be possible to produce her play at the Groves Press Evergreen Theater, an off-Broadway playhouse known for premiering provocative works. Whether Warhol seriously considered helping her or not, Valerie took Warhol at his word and became incredibly excited about the prospects of her play being produced. Soon, she wrote a letter to her family, promising that something big would materialize regarding her play. Around this time, her dreams were also dangled in front of her eyes by a publisher named Maurice Girardia. Maurice was a French publisher and self-described pornographer, specializing in bannable books like Lolita and Naked Lunch. Just like Valerie, Maurice was staying at the Chelsea Hotel. One day at the hotel, he put up a sign recruiting unknown writers to his nascent publishing house, Olympia Press. Valerie Solanas responded to the recruitment ad by sending Maurice her play, Up Your Ass. Maurice said that he found the play to be rather clever and wildly amusing. He also said that he found himself surprised to be in agreement with what he understood of her theories. Soon, Maurice presented Valerie with a contract promising her $500 up front and further installments and royalties later on. He would also get first refusal rights on her next 2 books. Valerie signed the contract, but it wasn't very long until she became paranoid about the deal. Valerie started to believe that Maurice was trying to steal her work and that he roped her into a shady deal that gave up her rights to her next 2 books. She took the contract to Andy Warhol, whose lawyer told her that the contract wasn't legally binding and would not hold up in court. According to Warhol's filmmaking collaborator, Paul Morrissey, the contract was a stupid piece of paper with 2 sentences and tiny little letters. But Valerie believed that Warhol's lawyer was lying to her and that he had been paid to do so by Maurice, so she stormed out of his office while calling him a liar and a thief. Valerie was supposed to work on an autobiographical novel for Maurice, but she decided not to do so. Instead, she focused her attention on Andy Warhol, who had already started to lose interest in producing her work. She began to badger him incessantly about producing her play and making Scum into a movie starring her. The final straw came when she somehow got a hold of his home phone number, which freaked him out. Valerie's rage at Andy Warhol grew. She believed that Warhol had promised to help her, to make her famous. She took him at his word, and he lied to her. When she asked him for money, he said he'd pay her a small fee to be in one of his movies. She did so, but she was never paid for her work. Warhol was a user, she thought. People lined up to be used and discarded by him. He was well known for it. When a factory regular jumped off a building and died, Warhol famously commented that he wished he was there to film it. He put desperate people in his films who did humiliating things on camera, and he kept all of the profits for himself. He took people's ideas without crediting them, and never came up with any of his own. Valerie complained to Ultraviolet, a Warhol superstar, saying, "Those disgusting pigs, men. They're all leeches. Why do you let him exploit you? Why don't you shove a shiv in his chest or ram an ice pick up his ass?" Valerie believed that Maurice Giardia and Andy Warhol were working together to try and steal her work. She thought that Maurice was trying to steal her books, and that Warhol was trying to steal Scum to make a movie without her. In other words, they were united in a conspiracy against her. For much of 1968, Valerie felt what she described as a growing sickness. She was homeless, the weather was miserable, she was broke, and she couldn't trust anyone. With all of these circumstances weighing heavily on her mind, she began to consider killing Andy Warhol. It would be an act of vengeance as well as a desperate bid for fame. Shooting Andy Warhol would no doubt get the world talking. 1968 was dubbed America's bloodiest year in politics, and assassinations were more popular than ever. 2 months before Valerie Solanas shot Warhol, Martin Luther King was killed by James Earl Ray, and just 2 days after Valerie tried to take out Warhol, Saran murdered Robert Kennedy. It was a tumultuous time, and Valerie Solanas finally fit right in with the current zeitgeist. On June 3rd, 1968, Valerie woke up bright and early. She put on her flat cap, applied makeup, and filled her bag with a Kotex pad, a .32 Beretta automatic, as well as a .22 Colt revolver, just in case her other gun jammed. She spent the morning visiting people as a final-ditch effort to get her play produced. First, she went to the actor's studio looking to speak with Lee Strasberg, but she was quickly ushered away. Then she went to the apartment of Margot Feeden, who at the time was in the Guinness Book of World Records as the youngest ever Broadway producer. Margot invited Valerie in, who she described as having a loud smell, but also as intelligent and articulate. Valerie told Margot all about her work, particularly the Scum Manifesto. When Valerie was finished, she asked Margot if she would produce her play. Margot said no, and in response, Valerie showed her her gun. Margot's baby daughter was sleeping only inches away, so she tried to calm Valerie down. Then Valerie announced that she would shoot Andy Warhol and that it would make the play famous enough for Margot to want to produce it. Margot tried to explain to Valerie that it wouldn't make her want to produce a play, and that she shouldn't try to kill Andy Warhol. However, Valerie wouldn't listen. When she left Margot's apartment, Margot tried to call the authorities to warn them, but they thought she was making a prank call. One police dispatcher told her, "You can't arrest someone because you believe she's going to kill Andy Warhol." When Valerie arrived at the factory, Andy Warhol was out filling his prescription for Obertrol, an amphetamine he took daily. By this point, Valerie was on Warhol's Do Not Take Calls From list, so when she tried to enter the factory, she was quickly sent away. Valerie waited outside for Warhol. While waiting, she took the elevator up to the factory loft around 7 times to see if Warhol had finally arrived. Warhol showed up at 4:15 p.m., and Valerie rode up the elevator with him. He made a comment about her heavy wool coat and how it seemed too hot for the summer weather. He also noticed that she was wearing feminine makeup, an unusual move for Valerie. Inside the factory was Warhol's filmmaking collaborator, Paul Morrissey, an assistant named Fred Hughes, and an art critic named Mario Amaya who was visiting to have a meeting with Warhol. Warhol complimented Valerie's appearance in front of everyone, saying, "Look, doesn't Valerie look good?" Then he explained to her that he was too busy and had a lot of business to attend to, so she should leave. As Warhol spoke on the phone, Valerie must have been acutely aware of the sound of her beating heart, the shallowness of her breath. She probably felt the weight of her 2 guns in her bag. She could sense that her window of opportunity, her time to strike, was drawing to a close. It was now or never. Shoot the greedy, manipulative bastard now, and her creative work would be immortalized forever. Kill Andy Warhol. Before anybody noticed, Valerie pulled the Beretta's hammer back and aimed at Warhol. Then she fired and missed. No one but Valerie knew what the loud bang was. A whip, a sniper, a bomb going off in the Communist Party's office 2 floors above? No one knew. Right before Valerie took her second shot, Warhol noticed her aiming at him and pleaded for his life. The second shot was also a miss. Warhol darted under a desk, and finally, Valerie fired a shot that made an impact. The bullet went through the right side of his abdomen and made a mess of his organs before exiting through the left side of his back. Valerie said that Warhol fell gracefully, like a slow-motion ballet dance of death. She added that he wasn't one to just fall on the floor and die like a normal person. Next, Valerie shot the visiting art critic Mario Amaya. Luckily, it went cleanly through his hip, and he suffered no damage to his organs. In fact, later he was standing up and surprised that he could walk after just being shot. Right before Valerie left the building, she tried to shoot Warhol's assistant, Fred Hughes, who begged her not to kill him, saying, "You can't, I'm innocent. I didn't do anything to you." Fred's words must have worked because Valerie turned around towards the elevator. But then she had a change of mind and turned back around to shoot him. Then, as if by an act of God, her gun jammed, leaving Fred Hughes with his life. "There's the elevator, Valerie. Just take it," Hughes said, and she did. Valerie turned around and exited the building. Technically, Valerie killed Andy Warhol, but only for the 90 seconds or so that he was pronounced legally dead. In the end, he survived, but missing a spleen, which had to be surgically removed. While in and out of delirium, Warhol recalled hearing from a television set that Kennedy was shot. In his confused state, he thought that he was surely dead and that, quote, "After you die, they rerun things for you, like President Kennedy's assassination." The shooting changed Warhol for the rest of his life. Not only did it kill him decades later due to prolonged complications, it also killed the factory for good. He spent the rest of his life avoiding strangers and terrified of any sudden loud noises. As for Valerie, she attempted to defend herself in court. Her mental state continued to deteriorate, and eventually she was declared insane and unfit for trial. She spent the next 3 years being transferred from mental hospitals to detention centers and to different prisons. While she was incarcerated, Maurice Giordia published the Scum Manifesto, and as Valerie predicted, her newfound infamy made it an instant success. The manifesto took hold particularly with feminists like T. Grace Atkinson, president of the New York chapter of the National Organization for Women, known as NOW. T. Grace Atkinson called the Scum Manifesto, quote, "the most important feminist statement written to date in the English language." She tried to help Valerie through her legal trial, but quickly learned that Valerie punished anybody who treated her well. Despite Valerie's abusiveness towards her, T. Grace Atkinson left her feminist organization NOW partly in defense of Valerie. In her biography about Valerie Solanas, Breanne Fahs attributes these events as leading to the birth of radical feminism. However, Valerie didn't consider herself a feminist. She said she thought they were schmucks and that she was a writer and artist and nothing else. When she was released from prison, Valerie tried to reconnect with Andy Warhol. Since the time she was in prison, she had been writing letters to him, sometimes threatening, other times asking for help, and sometimes even becoming sentimental about their relationship. Even though she shot him, Andy Warhol was surprisingly soft on Valerie. He decided not to press charges on her, and later on, he even refused to attend one of her trials, which led to her getting a lighter sentence. While Valerie was briefly out on bail in 1968, she started to call Warhol obsessively, asking him to help her career, the Scum Manifesto, and to get her on the Johnny Carson show. Allegedly, she threatened to do it again if he didn't comply. Terrified, Warhol, quote, "went mad on limousine rides around town to evade her." He reported her to the district attorney's office and she was rearrested. However, she continued to send him threatening letters for the rest of his life. By this point, Valerie was convinced that a shadowy organization called the Mob was after her. Men in the Mob, which wasn't the Mafia by the way, were Andy Warhol, Maurice Giordia, Howard Hughes, Robert Sarnoff, Mark Sussman from Playboy Enterprises, and Barney Rosette, publisher of Grove Press. She believed they were behind all the misfortunes in her life and that they had implanted a listening device in her uterus. When Valerie was once again released from prison in June 1971, she quickly set about harassing these men. This led to her landing back in a psychiatric hospital in 1972 after she threatened an editor with an ice pick in his home. Remarkably, Valerie escaped the mental hospital before being rearrested. By 1979, she was living on the streets in Phoenix, Arizona. She was well known by the police for doing bizarre things such as crowing like a chicken in the middle of traffic. In 1985, she was living in San Francisco and supporting herself in a methamphetamine addiction with sex work. On April 25, 1988, she was found dead in her hotel room. She was kneeling on the floor and facing down on the side of the bed. Her body had been decomposing for at least a week. Her cause of death was linked to her heavy smoking habit. She had just turned 52. So that's the story of Valerie Solanas. If you'd like to support this channel, please consider donating to my Patreon or becoming a channel member. I've decided to try to post a single video every couple of months while working on a larger documentary in the background. So let me know what you think of shorter and more frequent videos like these. Shout out to Ryan Probert once again for the fantastic music he composed for this video. And until next time,